But please now welcome to the stage Dr. David Van Ghent.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Honoured guests, Reverend Nile, Senate candidates, Dr Morse, Nick, you've come so far and we really appreciate you ducking up to Queensland for this extra leg. We promise to show you some of the real Australia while you're here in the next couple of days. Now, as Wendy said, I'm here representing the Australian Marriage Forum, one of the groups who are working so hard to try and keep our country aware of why we need to keep marriage what it is, what it's always been, what it can only be. Now, as Wendy said, on July the 2nd, if Labor wins the federal election, marriage will be redefined within 100 days. If the coalition wins, then the nation will have a national vote, a plebiscite. That is the lesser of the two evils. But both of them are symptoms of our advanced social dementia, because a sane society would know that some things are simply beyond the authority of any government, any American court, any Australian plebiscite to repeal. Marriage is not a social invention to be cut to shape according to political fad. It is a social recognition of pre-existing biological reality, male, female, and offspring. The great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss defined marriage as a social institution built upon a biological foundation, end quote. All of our marriage laws and customs exist to reinforce that biological foundation, to keep a man with his mate for the sake of social stability, but above all for the sake of any child they might create. Now, not all marriages create children, but typically they do, and institutions exist for the typical case. Married couples who don't create children are still fully married because they meet the twin criteria of marriage. First, that they bring together the two great halves of nature, male and female, in that one flesh union. And second, that they can give a child, albeit an adopted child, the mother and father relationship that every child needs. Now, same-sex couples obviously do not bring together the two halves of nature in a one-flesh union, and they cannot give a child, any child, the relationship with a mother and father that a child needs. Their relationship matters greatly to them and it demands neighbourly civility, but it is a different thing to the great natural project of marriage and family, and they need to find a different word. Surveying all of human history and culture, Claude Lévi-Strauss observes that the family is, quote, based on a union of two individuals of opposite sexes who establish a household and bear and raise children, end quote. Go back as far in written history as it is possible to go, and you will always find marriage of man and woman as the natural and necessary basis of society. The ancient Romans gave us the word matrimony for marriage, made up of two words, mater, meaning mother, and monium, meaning state or condition. So matrimony is the institution built around the condition of motherhood. And mothers are built around babies for 9 intimate months and beyond. And babies are built around the double helix of DNA, one strand from the mother, one strand from the father, intertwined, encoded into a new name that has never before been spoken, moulded into a face that resembles that one man and that one woman who gave that baby existence. Now that's matrimony. That's marriage and family. That is nature's masterpiece. And it can only be a man-woman thing. But LGBT activists disagree. They don't want to find a different word for their relationship. They want to use the same word and give it a different meaning. And they tell us we must do this because it's a matter of equality. To which we say, well, wait a minute, what about equality for kids? Their equal right, wherever possible, to have both a mother and a father. And if you say it's all about equal love, we say, well, if equal love for two men means destroying the love between a mother and her baby, what's loving about that? As you consider the LGBT lobby's demand for equality, I want you to remember just two numbers, 1% and 100%. The Australian Bureau of Statistics says that 1% of couples in Australia are same-sex couples. And Parliament has told us that same-sex couples have 100% the same benefits and legal status as any other couple in Australia, married or de facto, homosexual, heterosexual. The same. Since 2008, when 85 laws were amended by a bipartisan majority of federal parliament, there has been no unjust discrimination against same-sex couples in Australia, whether in taxation, superannuation, Medicare, DVA spouse entitlements, next of kin status, anything. A same-sex couple in Australia is a de facto couple, with exactly the same standing as, for example, our former first couple, the Honourable Julia Gillard and her partner Tim Matheson. Neither of those couples are married, and neither need to be married to enjoy the same status and benefits as a married couple. So, only 1% of couples are same-sex, but even fewer of them actually want to get married. According to Dutch figures, only 1 in 5 same-sex couples were married 11 years after Holland legalised same-sex marriage. So where is the great issue of injustice here if same-sex couples already have exactly the same legal status and benefits as other de facto couples in Australia, and the vast majority of same-sex couples don't want to get married anyway? Keep that reality check in mind when you consider the 3 claims that we will hear again and again over the course of the national plebiscite, that we have a moral duty to change marriage for the sake of, 1, making same-sex couples feel normal and included. 2, making children of same-sex households feel normal and included. And 3, making gay kids feel normal and included. Those will be the 3 arguments relentlessly put forward in moving commercials and stories throughout the plebiscite. Now, when I debated Rodney Croome, the head of Australian Marriage Equality, on ABC Radio last August, he made the case for the first point. He said, quote, "To exclude same-sex couples from such a core institution sends a message that stigmatises same-sex relationships and puts us out in the cold. Marriage equality, says Rodney, will bring us in from the cold." End quote. But wait a minute, you say. We've just heard that most same-sex couples want to stay out in the cold. 4 out of 5 couples in Holland who could have married didn't because, marriage is like so totally not gay. And hundreds of thousands of heterosexual de facto couples in Australia are also out in the cold. But they don't seem to mind. They get all the benefits and status of marriage without a marriage certificate, just like same-sex couples do. So we say to Mr. Croome, don't invent injustice where it doesn't exist. Same-sex couples are de facto couples, and that's as high a status as you can get. Then Mr. Croome made the second claim, quote, "Children being raised by same-sex couples should have the affirmation, sense of security, sense of stability that comes with having married parents." End quote. To which we say, well, wait a minute. Children being raised by same-sex couples already have exactly the same legal security and stability as children in any other de facto household. Are you saying, Rodney, that all de facto households make children insecure and unstable? Or is it just a problem with same-sex de facto households? No answer. So there's no injustice to see here. Let's move along. Thank you. The third point, you reminded me, the third point. This is the argument that we must redefine marriage to make kids feel normal and included, gay kids feel normal and included. Now, of course, we want to ease the emotional burden on young people who are afflicted by unwanted same-sex attraction, something they never chose, and of course, which does not in itself carry any moral blame. But you do not overturn the foundational institution of society as a form of psychological therapy for some troubled kids. There are less radical ways to help. And remember, there are other ways to make these young people feel loved and included in our families, our schools and our churches, short of this radical action. And just put this one fact in your mind, that a full 2/3 of teenagers who identify as gay will no longer identify as gay a matter of months or years later. It is a passing stage of confusion for most teens who say they are gay. It would seem a little excessive, don't you think, to redefine marriage in order to make gay kids feel better about themselves, only to find out that as adults they're no longer gay and they're happy to marry by the old rules. Nevertheless, this argument will be kept at the forefront of the marriage plebiscite. It was powerfully expressed by the former Irish President Mary McAleese, mother of a gay man, before the Irish referendum on gay marriage last year. She said, "The only children affected by this referendum will be Ireland's gay children. We have to make it happen for them and for all the unborn gay children who are relying on us to end the branding, end the isolation, end the inequality once and for all." End quote. But do you see how redefining marriage is simply a means to another end, which is bringing about acceptance and equalisation of homosexuality generally? Indeed, after the Irish referendum was won by the gay marriage side, McAleese made this agenda abundantly clear when she said, quote, "There is more to be done, for the work of dismantling the entire architecture of homophobia is still not complete. The achievement of marriage equality surely and irrevocably propelled us further along the road." End quote. Now, dismantling the entire architecture of homophobia is another way of saying imposing the entire architecture of homophilia, or compelling society not just to tolerate, but to accept and affirm the entire spectrum of rainbow politics. And so we begin to understand that the marriage equality campaign is not really about marriage. Until the mid-90s, gay activists wanted nothing to do with marriage. It was a patriarchal, bourgeois, repressive institution, incompatible with the exuberant, open relationships of the gay subculture. But then they realised that there was a new thing in town called anti-discrimination law, and that getting marriage equality in law would give them the legal clout to complete the sexual revolution. Marriage equality is about normalising the full LGBT rainbow spectrum with the force of law. Marriage is only a means to that end, the most powerful means, because once homosexual relations are normalised in the central institution of society, that gives the LGBT lobby the big stick of anti-discrimination law to normalise homosexual behaviour in the schools and to silence dissenters in the churches and elsewhere. That is why American activist Michelangelo Signorile urged gay people, quote, to fight for same-sex marriage and its benefits, and then, once granted, redefine the institution of marriage completely. That is why lesbian activist Masha Gessen told us at the Sydney Writers' Festival in 2012 that there is a whole lot more to the gay marriage campaign than meets the eye. She said, quote, "Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we intend to do with marriage when we get there, because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change. And again, I don't think it should exist, end quote. These are not the words of homosexual people who just want to fit in with marriage the way it is and have a quiet life. No, these are the words of culture warriors who want to take marriage and remake it in their own sexually radical image. If you go along with them and vote yes at the plebiscite, you will get the full genderless agenda, not just same-sex marriage. Genderless marriage means radical LGBT sex education for your children or grandchildren, and parents will have no say. Genderless marriage means silencing conscientious objectors with that big stick of anti-discrimination law. And above all, genderless marriage means depriving future children of their birthright to the love of their mother and their father. That is the heart of opposition to same-sex marriage, that it means same-sex parenting, and same-sex parenting means that future children must miss out on either their mum or their dad. That's because marriage is a package deal under Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to marry and to found a family, end quote. Therefore, homosexual marriage includes both the legal recognition of an exclusive relationship and the right to form a family by artificial reproduction such as surrogacy. But any child created within that new institution would have no possibility of being raised by their mother and their father. Now, of course, we already have situations where a child cannot have both their mum and their dad, such as the death or desertion of a parent. But that's not something we would wish upon a child. And it's not something that government should ever impose on a child. There are already situations where broken families reform as a homosexual household, and nothing can or should be done about that. But what we must not allow is the situation where government facilitates the deliberate creation of motherless or fatherless families. Labor Senator Penny Wong and others insist that same-sex couples already obtain children by adoption or surrogacy, so nothing is going to change with same-sex marriage. But that's just not correct. A number of states rightly prohibit same-sex couples from adopting or creating a child by surrogacy on the grounds that it's not in the best interests of the child. But a federal law for same-sex marriage will overrule those state restrictions. Such a law would become the nationwide permanent violation of a child's right, wherever possible, to be raised by both mother and father. Australian ethicist Professor Margaret Somerville observed that same-sex marriage, quote, forces us to choose between giving priority to children's rights or homosexual adult claims, end quote. The plebiscite forces us to choose. The claims of homosexual adults always take priority with the progressive media, who frame the debate narcissistically in terms of the desires and equal rights of adults. Our goal at the Australian Marriage Forum has always been to try and reframe the debate with the child at the centre. And a child has the right to her mum and dad, to be nurtured by their complementary love. She has the right to look up and see the only two faces on earth that reflect her own. A little girl should not have to look up and see two married men posing as her parents. Neither man, however good a man he might be, can be a mother to that little girl. They cannot guide her as a mother would when she is growing from girl to woman. They cannot model for her the complex relationship of husband and wife. Likewise, any boy needs his father's companionship, an example to help him become a man. No matter how competent and caring a lesbian partner might be, she cannot be a dad to a little boy. Sociologist David Popenoe sums up the settled science on what family structure is best for a child when he says, compared to all other family forms, families headed by married biological parents are best for children, end quote. Now, we know that an institution of same-sex marriage would deliberately prevent a child being raised by one or other biological parent. Therefore, it knowingly disadvantages the child. And research last year by Sullins finds at least double the rate of serious emotional problems for children who are raised in same-sex households compared to opposite-sex households. So how is a government policy for same-sex marriage consistent with the principle of the best interests of the child? At this point, people say, well, there's bad parents, there's abusive mothers and fathers. Surely it's better for a child to have two loving carers of the same sex than a dysfunctional pair of biological parents. I could go into the science on that, I won't, except to say that neither option gives a child what they need. We must reject both restraining parents who would inflict abuse on a child while also restraining governments who would inflict laws that steal a child's birthright to her mother and her father. And the second part of that package deal, more briefly, is that genderless marriage means radical LGBT sex education for your children or grandchildren, and parents will have no say. After New York State passed its state same-sex marriage law in 2011, Daniel Villarreal wrote, quote, I and a lot of other people want to indoctrinate, recruit, teach and expose children to queer sexuality, and there's nothing wrong with that, end quote. Here in Australia, the sexual radicals running the Safe Schools program agree. The principal author, Ros Ward, sees indoctrination with queer sexuality as a continuation of the Marxist quest to destroy bourgeois structures. The Australian newspaper reports, quote, addressing the Marxism 2015 conference in Melbourne, Ros Ward railed against the, quote, push to fit people into gender constructs that promote heterosexuality. Programs like the Safe Schools Coalition, she says, are making some difference, but we're still a long way from liberation. Marxism offers the hope and the strategy needed to create a world where human sexuality, gender, and how we relate to our bodies can blossom in extraordinary, new and amazing ways that we can only begin to imagine today, end quote. Well, Safe Schools, as you know, is a government-funded program that has been smuggled in under the pretext of reducing bullying, but in fact is a means of sexually radicalising your children with your money without you knowing about it. This is the program that teaches Year 7 students to imagine that they are 16 and going out with a person of the same sex that they are really into. It instructs children in the arts of breast binding and penis tucking to disguise their unwanted gender characteristics. That tells kids, quote, honestly, I'm bisexual, so I end up thinking of myself as having two virginities, my first time with a chick and my first time with a dude. These are your taxes at work. And thanks to the persistent work of groups like the Australian Christian Lobby and the courage of a few parents withdrawing their children from schools that teach this obscene program, the federal government has been forced to clamp down a little bit on safe schools. But this is the point. Once homosexual marriage is the law of the land, parents will no longer be able to push back against LGBT indoctrination in our schools. The logic is simple. If the law says homosexual marriage is normal and right, schools must teach that homosexual behaviour is normal and right. There is no option. Parents who object will be told by authorities that the state now has an interest in equality of all sexual relationships, and there is no basis for complaint. That is what we have observed overseas. So, vote for marriage equality and you are voting to relinquish control of your child's moral education to sexual radicals. Vote for marriage equality, and on the basis of President Obama's executive order this week to all 96,000 public schools in the US, you're also voting for your daughter to have to share change rooms with disturbed young men who claim they are women, all on the basis of genderless equality. Finally, vote for marriage equality, and you are voting for your pastor or your priest to be dragged before the thought police for daring to teach Christian doctrine on marriage and sexuality. In a graduation address at Campion College in Sydney in 2011, where my son went, the former Prime Minister John Howard said this: "Changing the definition of marriage, which has lasted for time immemorial, is not an exercise in human rights and equality. It is an exercise in deauthorising the Judeo-Christian influence in our society. And any who pretend otherwise are deluding themselves." End quote. He understood things, Mr. Howard. Canadian Queen's Counsel Barbara Finlay declared years ago, "The legal struggle for queer rights will one day be a showdown between freedom of religion versus sexual orientation." End quote. Consider a local showdown. We all know how Rodney Croome, the head of the gay lobby, took offence last year at the pastoral letter by Australia's Catholic bishops entitled "Don't Mess with Marriage," a beautiful, gracious booklet. It conveyed traditional Catholic teaching on marriage to students in Catholic schools, but that was unacceptable to the gay lobby. Croome said in a media release, "I urge everyone who finds that booklet offensive and inappropriate, including teachers, parents and students, to complain to the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner." In response, a transgender Tasmanian Greens candidate had reported Hobart's Archbishop Julian Porteous to the Commission. And interestingly, that pastoral letter contained this passage. Ready? "People who adhere to the perennial and natural definition of marriage will be characterised as old-fashioned, even bigots who must answer to the law." End quote. As columnist Angela Shanahan wrote about that episode, "Since when has teaching your children what you and most of the world's population believe to be right been a thought crime?" End quote. Now, just a week ago, that case was withdrawn, in my view, purely as a tactical withdrawal to scrape this barnacle off the hull of the marriage equality campaign. The Greens activist made clear there was no retraction of the substance of the complaint whatsoever. Now, all of this is happening while we have no law for same-sex marriage. What level of intimidation might we expect once homosexual marriage is the law of the land? "For if men do these things while the wood is green, what will they do when the wood is dry?" Overseas, we see that under laws for same-sex marriage, Catholic adoption agencies in a number of US states and the UK have had to close when compelled by authorities to place children equally with homosexual couples. A judgment of the European Court of Human Rights found that if same-sex marriage is legal in a member state, any church that refuses to marry same-sex couples would be guilty of discrimination. There should be no pretense in our parliament that churches can be guaranteed lasting exemption from the law of homosexual marriage. Most compellingly, the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court and 3 of his fellow justices were scathing last year about the prospects for authentic religious liberty under a regime of marriage equality, which, as you know, was imposed on the entire USA by their 5 unelected fellow judges last year. Chief Justice Roberts was particularly worried by the way the majority judges portrayed opponents of homosexual marriage as bigots. He said, "People of faith can take no comfort in the treatment they receive from the majority today. These assaults on the character of fair-minded people will have an effect in society and in court. It is one thing for the majority to conclude that the Constitution protects a right to same-sex marriage. It is something else to portray everyone who does not share the majority's better informed understanding as bigoted. End quote. The individual, likewise, will be given no exemption from holding the approved opinion on homosexual marriage. David Blankenhorn observed, quote, "Once this proposed reform became law, even to say the words out loud in public, 'every child needs a mother and father,' would probably be viewed as explicitly divisive and discriminatory, possibly even as hate speech. Consider the hounding and the sacking," that's the end of his quote, "but consider the hounding and sacking of the head of Mozilla, Brendan Eich, for daring to give a donation to Dr. Morse's campaign in California, defending natural marriage. And won't somebody please think of the bakers, is the mocking line we get from gay activists. But it's no joke. For father of 5, Aaron Klein of Oregon, who was fined $135,000 and lost his livelihood as a baker, just because a lesbian couple demanded he bake them a wedding cake and he, in good conscience, declined. Senator Wong last year in her National Press Club debate said that lesbian couples would simply avoid bakers who didn't want to bake them a cake. But of course the opposite is true. The whole objective is to identify those bakers or florists or photographers or wedding venue proprietors who are not compliant with the gay agenda and force them to comply or break them. And Senator Wong's boss, Labor leader Bill Shorten, made clear only last week, "There will be no room for dissenting conscience under a government I lead." He didn't say that, but that's what he meant. Not only will all members of his party be compelled to vote for homosexual marriage or be forced out of the party, ordinary citizens will also have their conscience compelled by law. Any refusal to provide goods and services on grounds of conscientious objection will be punished by the state under Mr. Shorten. The state's legal definition of right and wrong will be used to crush the individual's moral conviction of right and wrong. That is the short definition of tyranny. So, as I close, any law normalising homosexual marriage will be a truncheon in the fist of the thought police, enforcing approved opinion on sexuality via their human rights commissions. It will be a major cultural triumph for advocates of state authority over individual conscience. It will be a major step in deauthorising the Judeo-Christian influence in our society, and any who pretend otherwise are deluding themselves. So in summary, we say no to the radical rainbow package deal that comes with marriage equality. We say that our fellow citizens, our friends and family who are same-sex attracted are our equals in every way. They have exactly the same legal status and benefits as any other couple under Australian law. Many of us here would say, fundamentally, they are equally loved by God. We say they are free to live as they choose and love whom they will, but they are not free to choose a motherless or fatherless existence for future children. They are not free to impose radical LGBT sex education on all of our children. They are not free to silence pastors and conscientious objectors with that big stick of anti-discrimination law. And they are not free to so radically distort the true meaning of marriage, of parenting, and even of male and female, that future marriage and society will be unrecognisable. For the sake of our children, of our families and of our freedom, marriage must remain what it is, a man-woman thing. Thank you.